So my name is Karl Larsson. I am Managing Director at Aligned, and I will tell you a little bit about the possibilities of using key performance indicators when working with technical finds. And let me start out by putting out the premises. You can imagine the following situation, that you're developing a medical device, everything is going fine, but it's hectic, we're under pressure, there is a big team involved, we are working on a lot of documents simultaneously. We need to get everything ready at the release date. Since if we are late, we're going to lose money on that. And if the documentation is wrong, well, then maybe patient safety is at risk, or fines are going to be distributed, or people might even end up in prison. So we all know that the compliance of the technical file is essential to the medical device release. So while you are now in this frenzy of activity, there are a couple of questions that pop up, namely, in terms of technical file progress, how do we know where we are at a given point in time? How do we know which work remains until we can confidently release our documentation? And will we have the time to close these gaps before the release? So one ubiquitous way of measuring progress is using so-called key performance indicators. And a key performance indicator is essentially a way of measuring how well an organization does compared to the relative objectives. It's usually a measurement of an activity and how successful you are at achieving this activity. The idea is that this activity is closely related to the objectives of the organization. So when this metric, this indicator, goes up or reaches its goal, we know for sure that we are closer to achieving our objectives. One of the beauties with a key performance indicator is that it's a single number, making it very easy to understand. It's not a graph, it's not a pie chart, it's not complicated, it's a single metric, a single number, easy to understand, easy to communicate, and preferably it's also an actionable metric, meaning that if we see that the metric is not reaching a target, we can act on it and change it. So for example, even though we know that the number of sunny days has a large impact on ice cream sales, the number of sunny days is not a good KPI because we can't act on it really. We can't change the number of sunny days really. So at the bottom here, I have some examples of KPIs used in industries. For example, for airlines, we have the average percentage of booked seats, because we know that each flight basically costs the same. So we want to make sure that as many seats as possible are booked. Therefore, you might have also experienced the fact of that these seats get overbooked sometimes. So when you start your flight, you get the message that I'm sorry that you have your ticket, but your seat is already taken. We gave it to somebody else, which is an effect of trying to reach the highest possible percentage of booked seats. When we talk about hotels, average length of stay can be a good KPI because the cost driver in the hotel business is the turnover of rooms. So when somebody leaves a room, that incurs costs because we need to clean it, we need to work on it. So the longer we can have our guests staying during a booking, the lower the costs and the higher the revenues relatively. If you work in a hospital, for example, then you might want your average length of stay be as short as possible because beds is a scarce resource and your objective might need to be to deliver as much care as possible to as many patients as possible in a given time. If you work in a restaurant, the average customer waiting time might be a good KPI because none of us really like to wait in line for food. So if we can see that this customer waiting time might be a KPI that we want to keep really, really low. And if we see that it's increasing, we need to investigate why are people waiting for their table or waiting for food and what can we do about that. So KPIs are widely used in many industries. And there is kind of a theory how you come up with a good KPI. And it usually starts out by articulating your goals and objectives. So if you don't know what you want to achieve or what your goals and objectives are, then you will have a problem with your KPIs later on. And we will talk about that later. So from these goals and objectives, you can now derive something called critical success factors, like what do we need to do or achieve, what kind of activities are involved in reaching those goals and objectives. And you can then pick one or more of these critical success factors and then try to find a metric that will measure or show the success of that particular critical success factor. So you break these things down from your goals and objectives down to critical success factors, and you derive a performance metric from there. So if you want to win the Champions League, if that's your goal, we know that the critical success factor might be to score goals as one of the critical success factors. And how do you measure that? Well, maybe you can measure then the time percent attacking during a game, because you spend more time on attacking, perhaps then you might score more goals. So it's important that these things are aligned. If they're not aligned, you can have outcomes that are not expected. And of course, it's important that you set a target for your KPI. It's not only that you measure something, but you also need to set a target that you want to achieve. It's also important to mention that you need to define your audience when you develop a KPI. Who is going to act on this KPI? It's also very important that the people that are meant to act on this KPI also have the possibility to do that. So what does this mean for our particular situation? We are talking about technical file progression. So let's do this exercise. And what is the goal? Well, the goal is to develop a compliant technical file. That's the desired outcome, preferably in time. And what are the critical success factors for being compliant in terms of documentation? Well, it's that our documents are complete, that they are correct, and that they are consistent. We know that we have a large number of documents. We know that they are interdependent. And therefore, it's also important for us that these interdependent documents don't contradict each other, but that they are consistent among themselves. Can we derive performance metrics for these critical success factors? Well, one approach would then be to look at document metrics, and on the other side, also take a look at document content metrics. So if we start out by looking at document metrics, they could look like this, like, do we have the right documents? The documents that we expect to have at the release, are they at all present? Of course, it would be preferable if they're up to date, that they're not stale and contain old and inconsistent information. We are also forced to follow some kind of review and approval process. So these documents need to be reviewed. We need to have proof of them being reviewed, and they should also be released in consistency with our document management SOP. So I'm going to show you some examples now from our system aligned elements, which can manage documents like this. And in aligned elements, you in a dashboard then can get these metrics like missing DHF documents. So we can define which documents we expect to be there. And if these documents are not there, this will then be highlighted in a metric. So 2 missing DHF documents is an indication of that we need to create these documents, get the right content in there, review and approve them. We can also let the system inspect these documents and find out if they are outdated, if they contain old information, old references, etc., and signalize this. It's also possible to track the review status of documents. So one metric would be, are all the documents reviewed? And if they're not reviewed, that's definitely something we need to look at to make sure that they get reviewed, and we need to investigate why they aren't reviewed. Is it because they're not finished, or is it because the it's unclear who's going to review them, or is it because the person we want to review this document that is in vacation or whatnot? So if we start out with this metric, we can then start act on this metric and find out what's behind this number. We need, of course, to have these documents approved. So in a system that can handle electronic signatures, we can, of course, electronically track if there are open signatures, if people have documents pending, depending on they're not being signed or not, so we can track this as well. So when we have these kind of metrics, we have a much better overview or transparency of what are the at least formal aspects that needs to be covered. Then we can try to assess how much work is this? How much do we need to work? How much time is this going to take? What are the people that are going to be involved in solving these issues? And also, of course, we have a much better starting point for investigating why the metrics are like they are. But all of us who have worked with medical device development and technical files, we know that just having the documents is not going to help us if the content of the documents are not correct and not consistent. So we should also pay attention on the document content, and there are some really interesting metrics that we can derive from the document content as well. So I'm going to look at 3 different areas: on requirement management, on risk management, and on test management, and show you some examples from aligned elements, what indicators could be that would then signalize whether the document content is consistent or not. Starting out with requirements management, we can let the system now analyze, do we have empty fields in our requirements? And if we have empty fields, that's then a signal of that there is more work to be done on some of our requirements, because we know if the auditor finds this, we're going to have a problem. We might have some design inputs or requirements that are explicitly marked with, for example, to be done or to be worked on, and we can let the system pick this up and signalize this, that apparently there are some requirements here that need some more work. So this is an example of how we can analyze the completeness of our requirements using KPIs. We can also look at the consistency, analyzing the traceability. So here we have a project where we have 6 requirements that do not trace to any specifications. And that could be an indication of that although the requirements have been written down, they have never been implemented in the device. So that is clearly something that we need to address, because a requirement without a trace to a spec is really a problem that an auditor would not appreciate. In this particular system, we also have a high number of requirements that do not have an incoming trace from a user need. So apparently we have developed requirements that are not explicitly derived from a user need. So why are they there at all? Is it because we have forgotten to set a trace from a user need, meaning that there are user needs that don't have traces to requirements, which is also not a good thing? Or is it simply gold plating? Are we adding more requirements than necessary to our system that nobody really asks for? So that's then looking at the traceability, making sure that we are consistent all the way through the V model concerning requirements management. We could then move on to risk management, a topic that I really like. And here everyone has probably performed several risk assessments according to ISO 14971, and you're familiar with the steps. You identify the risks, you evaluate the risks, you mitigate risks that are not acceptable, you implement these mitigations, and you make sure that through verification that the mitigations are effective. Again, since risk management can be integrated and should be integrated in aligned elements, you can pick up these metrics from the system. For example, analyzing the potential hazards that we have in our lists, for example, from the Annex of 4971, Annex C, and address, have all the potential hazards that we should analyze been analyzed, and have we qualified if they are applicable to our device or not. And apparently the case here is that some potential hazards still remain unassessed, and we should take some time to assess them. And this is something that we should have done long ago, since we know that if the hazard is applicable, it might have design implications on our device. This is not a good number at all. Moving on to the next one, here we have evaluated, apparently there are a number of hazardous situations that have been identified, but they have not yet been evaluated in terms of severity, of probabilities, to figure out to what extent they are acceptable or unacceptable. So again, this is clearly work that needs to be done before we are consistent in our risk management. Furthermore, let's say that we have evaluated a large number of hazardous situations. We then know that some of them will be unacceptable. And the system picks up on this as well, of course, and then marks these risks as insufficiently mitigated. So if we have unacceptable risks, we should, of course, mitigate them. And if they're not sufficiently mitigated, the system will let you know. So we clearly have a number of risks here which are not sufficiently mitigated that we need to address either by finding effective mitigations, or we need to come up with an explanation in our risk-benefit analysis that warrants why it is acceptable to release an obviously risky product to the market. And continuing down the line, we have then mitigations that we have identified that will mitigate identified risks. But of course, the work doesn't stop there. We need to make sure that these mitigations are implemented and verified. So they should, of course, trace to some kind of design input, a requirement, or a spec. And if this is not the case, of course, the system should pick this up and present it as a KPI so we can address it efficiently in time. Last but not least, we have some example from test management here integrated in a dashboard and aligned. It's the same thing here. We can let the system pick out tests that are blocked for some reason, meaning that there are tests that can't be performed right now for some reason or another. Maybe the device has not implemented a feature yet. We also have a high number of unexecuted tests, which we of course need to execute and perform in order to get valid test results before we submit our documentation. Of all the tests that we have performed, there are apparently a number of tests that have failed. And failed tests are something that we probably want to address. Maybe we want to make a fix for them. So the system will pick this up and tell you how many tests are failed and thus waiting to be fixed, so we can re-perform this test to generate valid results. Another KPI might be of all these unexecuted tests, some have been assigned to a tester, but apparently some tests haven't yet been assigned to a tester, so nobody really feels responsible for them at this particular point in time. And this is just examples of things, of KPIs that can be presented by a system like Aligned Elements, which then indicates to us what are the document content inconsistencies that we need to address before we submit our documentation or before we release our device. So a few observations here is that I don't think it's sufficient just to measure the document progress, to look at documents. We also need to look at document content. And I would expect some of you now to say that, look, Karl, the numbers that we've looked on so far, they are not really KPIs, are they? They're not really, in the classical sense, key performance indicators, because usually a key performance indicator is something that varies over time, that shows some kind of a trend. And I totally agree with that these numbers might not be the classical example of key performance indexes, but it has to do a little bit with the nature of compliance. With compliance, we mean no deviations. So it will not fly to tell the auditor that, you know, we have 80% of our risks are mitigated, or 95% of our tests are passed. Compliance means no deviations, no errors, no inconsistencies, completeness, etc. So I totally understand this. We can also see that different users with different responsibilities in different departments have different needs. And of course, their KPIs should be relevant to them. And preferably, a metric should provide both insight, not to say, not presenting stuff that is absolutely trivial and obvious, but that provides some real insight and also are actionable. Meaning that if we see a metric, there is also an easy way to really work on these items. And in the example of aligned elements, by simply clicking on this tile here showing block test, we get immediate access to exactly those tests that are blocking and can address them immediately. So if you're interested in using key performance indicators when you do your technical file documentation, which ones should you use? Well, the most important one is that you should use metrics that align well with your goals. And this is a very known problem for KPIs, that, you know, this old saying that what is getting measured is the thing that gets done. So if you're unlucky, you choose an activity that is not necessarily very well connected with your goal. There's an example for during the Vietnam War, where the American kill ratio was a key performance indicator for them. But even though that was they reached their targets, they didn't win the war, so to say. So it's an example of how you're measuring, that you focus on activity and kind of lose sight of the objective or the results. It might also be dangerous to align or make incentives dependent on these KPIs, tying, for example, a bonus payment to a particular performance indicator. And my colleague Anders has a great example of how fixed bugs were used as a KPI that was also tied to the bonus payments of a software development team, which of course led to that they started to introduce bugs in the code so they can fix those bugs in order to get more money. And that's, of course, not what you intended to do with this KPI. I would also suggest that you use a metric that is based on timely available data, meaning that it should be easy, and also goes with the second item here, that it shouldn't cost too much to collect the data from which you derive your metric. Because if it takes a lot of time or is very expensive, it will simply not get done. You will shy from finding the data to present this KPI, and if it costs too much to get this data, nobody will really do it. It's also important that the metric that you suggest is supported by your team. A key performance index can be well used in rallying a team around some kind of target or a goal that is easily communicated. But that only makes sense if the team agrees on that this is a good KPI, this is something that I can work on, that we can work on together, that I have, if I'm responsible for this KPI, then I should also have the possibility to act on it. So these are some short examples then of how metrics can be used to track your technical file progression. We at Aligned develop medical device ALM for design control documentation, including all the design controls that goes into your technical documentation, your technical file, including risk management, DHF index, and so on. And we pay a lot of attention to making sure that you know that the data that you put in your documents are complete and consistent. So that was everything for me. Thank you very much for attending this session and for attending this seminar. If you have any questions right now, I'd be happy to answer them. I get an immediate question here from Werner Schöneberger. How easy is it to set up and maintain KPIs in the tool? From 1 to 10, how easy it is, and if 10 is the easiest, I would say 9. Being humble enough to say that there are some things that we can improve, but if you're interested in finding this out, I'll be happy to show it to you. So with that concluding remark, I have another question here. Do we get a seminar confirmation like last year? Let me reach out to you, Irene, and we can talk about that. With this concluding remark, I'd like to thank everyone for participating in this seminar. Thank you to our medical device experts. Please don't hesitate to reach out to them if you have questions. And I'll hope to see you here at our next virtual seminar that we're planning for this fall, hopefully, if not, then in a year's time. Everybody, stay safe, stay healthy, and thank you for tuning in.